In my office shows two gum-chewing stenographers who have just left the movies. One is talking to the other and says, "You know, Sadie, you know what the trouble with life is? There just ain't any background music." But it's more than that. It is a desperate search for personal identity to let other people know that at least you are alive. Let's take a common case in the ghetto. A man is living in a slum tenement. He doesn't know anybody and nobody knows him. He doesn't care for anyone because no one cares for him. On the corner newsstand are newspapers with pictures of people like Mayor Daley and other people from a different world, a world that he doesn't know, a world that doesn't know that he is even alive. When the organizer approaches him, part of what begins to be communicated is that through the organization and its power, he will get his birth certificate for life, that he will become known, that things will change from the drabness of a life where all that changes is the calendar. This same man, in a demonstration at City Hall, might find himself confronting the mayor and saying, "Mr. Mayor, we have had it up to here, and we are not going to take it anymore." Television cameramen put their microphones in front of him and ask, "What is your name, sir?" "John Smith." Nobody ever asked him what his name was before. "And then what do you think about this, Mr. Smith?" Nobody ever asked him what he thought about anything before. Suddenly he's alive. This is part of the adventure, part of what is so important to people in getting involved in organizational activities, and what the organizer has to communicate to him. Not that every member rules, for Radicals 122 will be giving his name on television, that's a bonus, but for once, because he is working together with a group, what he works for will mean something. Let us look at what is called process. Process tells us how. Purpose tells us why. But in reality, it is academic to draw a line between them. They are part of a continuum. Process and purpose are so welded to each other that it is impossible to mark where one leaves off and the other begins, or which is which. The very process of democratic participation is for the purpose of organization, rather than to rid the alleys of dirt. Process is really purpose. Through all this, the constant guiding star of the organizer is, in those words, the dignity of the individual. Working with this compass, he soon discovers many axioms of effective organization. If you respect the dignity of the individual you are working with, then his desires, not yours. His values, not yours. His ways of working and fighting, not yours. His choice of leadership, not yours. His programs, not yours, are important and must be followed. Except if his programs violate the high values of a free and open society. For example, take the question, what if the program of the local people offends the rights of other groups for reasons of color, religion, economic status, or politics? Should this program be accepted just because it is their program? The answer is categorically no. Always remember that the guiding star is the dignity of the individual. This is the purpose of the program. Obviously, any program that opposes people because of race, religion, creed, or economic status is the antithesis of the fundamental dignity of the individual. It is difficult for people to believe that you really respect their dignity. After all, they know very few people, in the beginning 123, including their own neighbors, who do. But it is equally difficult for you to surrender that little image of God, created in our own likeness, which lurks in all of us and tells us that we secretly believe that we know what's best for the people. A successful organizer has learned emotionally, as well as intellectually, to respect the dignity of the people with whom he is working. Thus, an effective organizational experience is as much an educational process for the organizer as it is for the people with whom he is working. They both must learn to respect the dignity of the individual, and they both must learn that in the last analysis, this is the basic purpose of organization, for participation is the heartbeat of the democratic way of life. We learn, when we respect the dignity of the people, that they cannot be denied the elementary right to participate fully in the solutions to their own problems. Self-respect arises only out of people who play an active role in solving their own crises, and who are not helpless, passive, puppet-like recipients of private or public services. To give people help, while denying them a significant part in the action, contributes nothing to the development of the individual. In the deepest sense, it is not giving, but taking their dignity. Denial of the opportunity for participation is the denial of human dignity and democracy. It will not work. In Rival for Radicals, I described an incident in which the government of Mexico once decided to pay tribute to Mexican mothers. A proclamation was issued that every mother whose sewing machine was being held by the Monte de Pied at the National Pawn Shop of Mexico should have her machine returned as a gift on Mother's Day. There was tremendous joy over the occasion. Here was a gift being made outright without any rules for Radicals 124 participation on the part of the recipients. Inside of 3 weeks, the exact same number of sewing machines was back in the pawn shop. Another example occurred in a statement made by the United Nations delegate from Liberia. Analyzing problems of Liberia, he noted that his nation had been deprived of the benefits of a previous history of colonialism. Press reaction was astonishment and ridicule, but the statement showed insight and wisdom. The people of Liberia had never been exploited by a colonial power, never been forced to band together at the risk of great personal sacrifice to revolt for freedom. They had been given freedom upon the establishment of their nation. Even freedom, as a gift, is deficient in dignity. Hence the political sterility of Liberia. As Finley Peter Dunn's Mr. Dooley put it, don't ask if our rights, take them. And don't let anyone give them to ye. A right that is handed to ye for nothing has something the matter with it. It's more than likely, it's only a wrong turned inside out. The organization has to be used in every possible sense as an educational mechanism, but education is not propaganda. Real education is the means by which the membership will begin to make sense out of their relationship as individuals to the organization and to the world they live in, so that they can make informed and intelligent judgments. The stream of activities and programs of the organization provides a never-ending series of specific issues and situations that create a rich field for the learning process. The concern and conflict about each specific issue in the beginning 125 leads to a speedily enlarging area of interest. Competent organizers should be sensitive to these opportunities. Without the learning process, the building of an organization becomes simply the substitution of one power group for another. Tactics: we will either find a way or make one. Hannibal. Tactics means doing what you can with what you have. Tactics are those consciously deliberate acts by which human beings live with each other and deal with the world around them. In the world of give and take, tactics is the art of how to take and how to give. Here our concern is with the tactic of taking. How the have-nots can take power away from the haves. For an elementary illustration of tactics, take parts of your face as the point of reference. Your eyes, your ears, and your nose. First, the eyes. If you have organized a vast, mass-based people's organization, you can parade it visibly before the enemy and openly show your power. Second, the ears. If your organization is small in numbers, then do what Gideon did. Conceal the members in the dark, but raise a din and clamor that will make the listener believe that your organization numbers many more than it does. Third, the nose. If your organization is too tiny even for noise, stink up the place. Always remember the first rule of power tactics. Tactics 127. Power is not only what you have but what the enemy thinks you have. The second rule is, never go outside the experience of your people. When an action or tactic is outside the experience of the people, the result is confusion, fear, and retreat. It also means a collapse of communication, as we have noted. The third rule is, wherever possible, go outside of the experience of the enemy. Here you want to cause confusion, fear, and retreat. General William T. Sherman, whose name still causes a frenzied reaction throughout the South, provided a classic example of going outside the enemy's experience. Until Sherman, military tactics and strategies were based on standard patterns. All armies had fronts, rears, flanks, lines of communication, and lines of supply. Military campaigns were aimed at such standard objectives as rolling up the flanks of the enemy army, or cutting the lines of supply, or lines of communication, or moving around to attack from the rear. When Sherman cut loose on his famous march to the sea, he had no front or rear lines of supplies, or any other lines. He was on the loose and living on the land. The South, confronted with this new form of military invasion, reacted with confusion, panic, terror, and collapse. Sherman swept on to inevitable Vic *. Power has always derived from two main sources, money and people. Lacking money, the have-nots must build power from their own flesh and blood. A mass movement expresses itself with mass tactics. Against the finesse and sophistication of the status quo, the have-nots have always had to club their way. In early Renaissance Italy, the playing cards showed swords for the nobility. The word spade is a corruption of the Italian word for sword, chalices, which became hearts for the clergy, diamonds for the merchants, and clubs as the symbol of the peasants. Rules for radicals 128 Tory. It was the same tactic that years later, in the early days of World War II, the Nazi panzer tank divisions emulated in their far-flung sweeps into enemy territory, as did our own General Patton with the American 3rd Armored Division. The fourth rule is, make the enemy live up to their own book of rules. You can kill them with this, for they can no more obey their own rules than the Christian Church can live up to Christianity. The fourth rule carries within it the fifth rule. Ridicule is man's most potent weapon. It is almost impossible to counterattack ridicule. Also, it infuriates the opposition, who then react to your advantage. The sixth rule is, a good tactic is one that your people enjoy *. If your people are not having a ball doing it, there is something very wrong with the tactic. The seventh rule, a tactic that drags on too long becomes a drag. Men can sustain militant interest in any issue for only a limited time, after which it becomes a ritualistic commitment, like going to church on Sunday mornings. New issues and crises are always developing, and one's reaction becomes, well, my heart bleeds for those people, and I'm all for the boycott, but after all there are other important things in life, and there it goes. The eighth rule. Keep the pressure on with different tactics and actions, and utilize all events of the period for your purpose. Alinsky takes the iconoclast's pleasure in kicking the biggest behinds in town, and the sport is not untempting. William F. Buckley, Jr. Chicago Daily News, October 19, 1966. Tactics 129, the ninth rule. The threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. The 10th rule. The major premise for tactics is the development of operations that will maintain a constant pressure upon the opposition. It is this unceasing pressure that results in the reactions from the opposition that are essential for the success of the campaign. It should be remembered not only that the action is in the reaction, but that action is itself the consequence of reaction and of reaction to the reaction ad infinitum. The pressure produces the reaction, and constant pressure sustains action. The 11th rule is, if you push a negative hard and deep enough, it will break through into its counter side. This is based on the principle that every positive has its negative. We have already seen the conversion of the negative into the positive in Mahatma Gandhi's development of the tactic of passive resistance. One corporation we organized against responded to the continuous application of pressure by burglarizing my home, and then using the keys taken in the burglary to burglarize the offices of the Industrial Areas Foundation, where I work. The panic in this corporation was clear from the nature of the burglaries, for nothing was taken in either burglary to make it seem that the thieves were interested in ordinary loot. They took only the records that applied to the corporation. Even the most amateurish burglar would have had more sense than to do what the private detective agency hired by that corporation did. The police departments in California and Chicago agreed that the corporation might just as well have left its fingerprints all over the place. In a fight, almost anything goes. It almost reaches the rules for radicals 130 point, where you stop to apologize if a chance blow lands above the belt. When a corporation bungles, like the one that burglarized my home and office, my visible public reaction is shock, horror, and moral outrage. In this case, we let it be known that sooner or later it would be confronted with this crime, as well as with a whole series of other derelictions, before a United States Senate subcommittee investigation. Once sworn in with congressional immunity, we would make these actions public. This threat, plus the fact that an attempt on my life had been made in Southern California, had the corporation on a spot where it would be publicly suspect in the event of assassination. At one point I found myself in a 30-room motel, in which every other room was occupied by their security. Men. This became another devil in the closet to haunt this corporation and to keep the pressure on. The 12th rule. The price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. You cannot risk being trapped by the enemy in his sudden agreement with your demand and saying you're right, we don't know what to do about this issue. Now you tell us. The 13th rule. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. In conflict tactics, there are certain rules that the organizer should always regard as universalities. One is that the opposition must be singled out as the target and frozen. By this I mean that in a complex, interrelated urban society, it becomes increasingly difficult to single out who is to blame for any particular evil. There is a constant and somewhat legitimate passing of the buck. In these times of urbanization, complex metropolitan governments, the complexities of major interlocked corporations, and the interlocking of political life between cities and tactics 131 counties, and metropolitan authorities, the problem that threatens to loom more and more is that of identifying the enemy. Obviously, there is no point to tactics unless one has a target upon which to center the attacks. One big problem is a constant shifting of responsibility from one jurisdiction to another. Individuals and bureaus one after another disclaim responsibility for particular conditions, attributing the authority for any change to some other force. In a corporation, one gets the situation where the president of the corporation says that he does not have the responsibility. It is up to the board of trustees or the board of directors. The board of directors can shift it over to the stockholders, etc., etc. And the same thing goes, for example, on the Board of Education appointments in the city of Chicago, where an extra legal committee is empowered to make selections of nominees for the board, and the mayor then uses his legal powers to select names from that list. When the mayor is attacked for not having any blacks on the list, he shifts the responsibility over to the committee, pointing out that he has to select those names from a list submitted by the committee. And if the list is all white, then he has no responsibility. The committee can shift the responsibility back by pointing out that it is the mayor who has the authority to select the names, and so it goes in a comic, if it were not so tragic, routine of who's on first or under which shell is the pea hidden. The same evasion of responsibility is to be found in all areas of life and other areas of City Hall urban renewal departments, who say the responsibility is over here, and somebody else says the responsibility is over there. The city says it is a state responsibility, and the state says it is a federal responsibility, and the federal government passes it back to the local community, and on ad infinitum. Rules for Radicals 132. It should be borne in mind that the target is always trying to shift responsibility to get out of being the target. There is a constant squirming and moving, and strategy purposeful and malicious at times, other times just for straight self-survival on the part of the designated target. The forces for change must keep this in mind and pin that target down securely. If an organization permits responsibility to be diffused and distributed in a number of areas, attack becomes impossible. I remember specifically that when the Woodlawn organization started the campaign against public school segregation, both the superintendent of schools and the chairman of the Board of Education vehemently denied any racist segregationist practices in the Chicago public school system. They took the position that they did not even have any racial identification data in their files, so they did not know which of their students were black and which were white. As for the fact that we had all white schools and all black schools, well, that's just the way it was. If we had been confronted with a politically sophisticated school superintendent, he could have very well replied, "Look, when I came to Chicago, the city school system was following, as it is now, a neighborhood school policy. Chicago's neighborhoods are segregated. There are white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods, and therefore you have white schools and black schools. Why attack me? Why not attack the segregated neighborhoods and change them?" He would have had a valid point of sorts. I still shiver when I think of this possibility. But the segregated neighborhoods would have passed the buck to someone else, and so it would have gone into a dog chasing his tail pattern, and it would have been a 15-year Tactics 133 job to try to break down the segregated residential pattern of Chicago. We did not have the power to start that kind of a conflict. One of the criteria in picking your target is the target's vulnerability. Where do you have the power to start? Furthermore, any target can always say, "Why do you center on me?" when there are others to blame as well. When you freeze the target, you disregard these arguments, and for the moment, all the others to blame. Then as you zero in and freeze your target and carry out your attack, all of the others come out of the woodwork very soon. They become visible by their support of the target. The other important point in the choosing of a target is that it must be a personification, not something general and abstract such as a community's segregated practices, or a major corporation, or city hall. It is not possible to develop the necessary hostility against, say, City Hall, which after all is a concrete, physical, inanimate structure, or against a corporation, which has no soul or identity, or a public school administration, which again is an inanimate system. John L. Lewis, the leader of the radical CIO labor organization in the 1930s, was fully aware of this, and as a consequence the CIO never attacked General Motors. They always attacked its president, Alfred I. Suwater L. and his Vane Sloan. They never attacked the Republic Steel Corporation, but always its president, Bloodied Hands, Tom Girdler. And so with us, when we attacked the then superintendent of the Chicago public school system, Benjamin Willis, let nothing get you off your target. With this focus comes a polarization. As we have indicated before, all issues must be polarized if action is to follow. The classic statement on polarization comes from Rules for Radicals 134. Christ, he that is not with me is against me, Luke 1:123. He allowed no middle ground to the money changers in the temple. One acts decisively only in the conviction that all the angels are on one side and all the devils on the other. A leader may struggle toward a decision and weigh the merits and demerits of a situation, which is 52% positive and 48% negative, but once the decision is reached, he must assume that his cause is 100% positive and the opposition 100% negative. He can't toss forever in limbo and avoid decision. He can't weigh arguments or reflect endlessly. He must decide and act. Otherwise there are Hamlet's words, and thus the native hue of resolution is sickly or with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. Many liberals, during our attack on the then school superintendent, were pointing out that after all he wasn't a 100% devil, he was a regular churchgoer, he was a good family man, and he was generous in his contributions to charity. Can you imagine in the arena of conflict, charging that so-and-so is a racist bastard, and then diluting the impact of the attack with qualifying remarks such as he is a good church-going man, generous to charity, and a good husband? This becomes political idiocy. An excellent illustration of the importance of polarization here was cited by Ruth McKenney in Industrial Valley, her classical study of the beginning of organization of the rubber workers in Akron, Ohio. Left bracket John L. Right bracket Lewis faced the mountaineer workers of Akron calmly. He had taken the trouble to pre-Tactics 135 pair himself with exact information about the rubber industry and the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. He made no vague, general speech, the kind the rubber workers were used to hearing from Green left bracket then president of the AF of L right bracket. Lewis named names and quoted figures. His audience was startled and pleased when he called Cliff Slusser by name, described him, and finally denounced him. The AF of L leaders, who used to come into Akron in the old days, were generally doing well if they remembered who Paul Litchfield was. The Lewis speech was a battle cry, a challenge. He started off by recalling the vast profits the rubber companies had always made, even during the deepest days of the Depression. He mentioned the Goodyear labor policy, and quoted Mr. Litchfield's pious opinions about the partnership of labor and capital. What he said in his deep, passionate voice, have Goodyear workers gotten out of the growth of the company? His audience squirmed in its seats, listening with almost painful fervor. Partnership, he sneered. Well, labor and capital may be partners in theory, but they are enemies in fact. The rubber workers listened to this with surprise and great excitement. William Green used to tell them about the partnership of labor and capital nearly as eloquently as Paul Litchfield. Here was a man who put into words what eloquent and educated, and even elegant words facts they knew to be true from their own experience. Here was a man who said things that made real sense to a guy who worked on a tire machine at Goodyear. Organize, Lewis shouted, and his voice echoed from the beams of the armory. Organ rules for radicals 136 eyes, he said, pounding the speaking pulpit until it jumped. Organize. Go to Goodyear and tell them you want some of those stock dividends. Say so. We're supposed to be partners, are we? Well, we're not. We're enemies. The real action is in the enemy's reaction. The enemy properly goaded and guided in his reaction will be your major strength. Tactics, like organization, like life, require that you move with the action. The scene is Rochester, New York, the home of Eastman Kodak, or rather Eastman Kodak, the home of Rochester, New York. Rochester is literally dominated by this industrial giant. For anyone to fight or publicly challenge Kodak is in itself completely outside of Rochester's experience. Even to this day, this company does not have a labor union. Its attitudes toward the general public make paternalistic feudalism look like participatory democracy. Rochester prides itself on being one of America's cultural crown jewels. It has its libraries, school system, university museums, and its well-known symphony. As previously mentioned, we were coming in on the invitation of the Black Ghetto to organize them. They literally organized to invite us in. The city was in a state of hysteria and fear at the very mention of my name. Whatever I did was news. Even my old friend and tutor, John L. Lewis, called me and affectionately growled, "I resent the fact that you are more hated in Rochester than I was." This was the setting. One of the first times I arrived at the airport, I was surrounded by reporters from the media. The first question was what I thought about Rochester as a city, and I replied, Tactics 137. It is a huge southern plantation, transplanted north. To the question why was I meddling in the Black Ghetto, after everything that Eastman Kodak had done for the blacks, there had been a bloody riot, National Guard, etc. The previous summer I looked blank and replied, maybe I am innocent and uninformed of what has been happening here, but as far as I know, the only thing Eastman Kodak has done on the race issue in America has been to introduce color film. The reaction was shock, anger, and resentment from Kodak. They were not being attacked or insulted, they were being laughed at, and this was insufferable. It was the first dart tossed at the big bull. Soon Eastman would become so angry that it would make the kind of charges that finally led to its own downfall. The next question was about my response to a bitter personal denunciation of me from W. Allen Wallace, the president of the University of Rochester and a present director of Eastman Kodak. He had been the head of the Department of Business Administration, formerly at the University of Chicago. He was at the university when it was locked in bitter warfare with the black organization in Woodlawn. Wallace, I replied. Which one are you talking about, Wallace of Alabama or Wallace of Rochester? But I guess there isn't any difference, so what was your question? This reply 1 introduced an element of ridicule, and 2, it ended any further attacks from the president of the University of Rochester, who began to suspect that he was going to be shafted with razors and that an encounter with me or with my associates was not going to be an academic dialogue. It should be remembered that you can threaten the enemy and get away with it. You can insult and annoy rules for radicals 138 him, but the one thing that is unforgivable and that is certain to get him to react is to laugh at him. This causes an irrational anger. I hesitate to spell out specific applications of these tactics. I remember an unfortunate experience with my rival for radicals, in which I collected accounts of particular actions and tactics employed in organizing a number of communities. For some time after the book was published, I got reports that would-be organizers were using this book as a manual, and whenever they were confronted with a puzzling situation, they would retreat into some vestibule or alley and thumb through to find the answer. There can be no prescriptions for particular situations because the same situation rarely recurs, any more than history repeats itself. People pressures and patterns of power are variables, and a particular combination exists only in a particular time. Even then, the variables are constantly in a state of flux. Tactics must be understood as specific applications of the rules and principles that I have listed above. It is the principles that the organizer must carry with him in battle. To these he applies his imagination, and he relates them tactically to specific situations. For example, I have emphasized, and Ray emphasized, that tactics means you do what you can, with what you've got, and that power in the main has always gravitated towards those who have money, and those whom people follow. The resources of the have-nots are 1, no money, and 2, lots of people. Alright, let's start from there. People can show their power by voting. What else? Well, they have physical bodies. How can they use them? Now a melding of ideas begins to appear. Use the power of the law by making the establishment obey its own rules. Go Tactics 139. Outside the experience of the enemy, stay inside the experience of your people. Emphasize tactics that your people will enjoy. The threat is usually more terrifying than the tactic itself. Once all these rules and principles are festering in your imagination, they grow into a synthesis. I suggested that we might buy 100 seats for one of Rochester's symphony concerts. We would select a concert in which the music was relatively quiet. The 100 blacks who would be given the tickets would first be treated to a 3-hour pre-concert dinner in the community, in which they would be fed nothing but baked beans, and lots of them. Then the people would go to the symphony hall, with obvious consequences. Imagine the scene when the action began. The concert would be over before the first movement. If this be a Freudian slip, so be it. Let's examine this tactic in terms of the concepts mentioned above. First, the disturbance would be utterly outside the experience of the establishment, which was expecting the usual stuff of mass meetings, street demonstrations, confrontations, and parades. Not in their wildest fears would they expect an attack on their prize cultural jewel, their famed symphony orchestra. Second, all of the action would ridicule and make a farce of the law, for there is no law, and there probably never will be, banning natural physical functions. Here you would have a combination not only of noise but also of odor, what you might call natural stink bombs. Regular stink bombs are illegal and cause for immediate arrest, but there would be absolutely nothing here that the police department, or the ushers, or any other servants of the establishment could do about it. The law would be completely paralyzed. Rules for radicals. 140 people would recount what had happened in the symphony hall, and the reaction of the listener would be to crack up in laughter. It would make the Rochester Symphony and the establishment look utterly ridiculous. There would be no way for the authorities to cope with any future attacks of a similar character. What could they do? Demand that people not eat baked beans before coming to a concert. Ban anyone from succumbing to natural urges during the concert. Announce to the world that concerts must not be interrupted by farting. Such talk would destroy the future of the symphony season. Imagine the tension at the opening of any concert. Imagine the feeling of the conductor as he raised his baton. With this would come certain fallouts. On the following morning, the matrons, to whom the symphony season is one of the major social functions, would confront their husbands, both executives and junior executives, at the breakfast table, and say, "John, we are not going to have our symphony season ruined by those people." Don't know what they want. But whatever it is, something has got to be done, and this kind of thing has to be stopped. Lastly, we have the universal rule that while one goes outside the experience of the enemy in order to induce confusion and fear, one must not do the same with one's own people, because you do not want them to be confused and fearful. Now let us examine this rule with reference to the symphony tactic. To start with, the tactic is within the experience of the local people. It also satisfies another rule, that the people must enjoy the tactic. Here we have an ambivalent situation. The reaction of the blacks in the ghetto, their laughter when the tactic was proposed, made it clear that the tactic, at least in fantasy, Tactics 141, was within their experience. It connected with their hatred of whitey. The one thing that all oppressed people want to do to their oppressors is cheat on them. Here was an approximate way to do this. However, we were also aware that when they found themselves actually in the symphony hall, probably for the first time in their lives, they would find themselves seated amid a mass of whites, many of them in formal dress. The situation would be so much out of their experience that they might congeal and revert back to their previous role. The very idea of doing what they had come to do would be so embarrassing, so mortifying, that they would do almost anything to avoid carrying through the plan. But we also knew that the baked beans would compel them physically to go through with the tactic regardless of how they felt. I must emphasize that tactics like this are not just cute. Any organizer knows, as a particular tactic grows out of the rules and principles of revolution, that he must always analyze the merit of the tactic and determine its strengths and weaknesses in terms of these same rules. Imagine the scene in the U.S. courtroom in Chicago's recent conspiracy trial of the 7 if the defendants and counsel had anally trumpeted their contempt for Judge Hoffman and the system. What could Judge Hoffman, the bailiffs, or anyone else do? Would the judge have found them in contempt for farting? Here was a tactic for which there was no legal precedent. The press reaction would have stunk up the judge for the rest of time. Another tactic involving the bodily functions developed in Chicago during the days of the Johnson-Goldwater campaign. Commitments that were made by the authorities to the Woodlawn Ghetto organization were not being met by the city. The political threat that had originally rules for Radicals 142 compelled these commitments was no longer operative. The community organization had no alternative but to support Johnson, and therefore the Democratic administration felt the political threat had evaporated. It must be remembered here that not only is pressure essential to compel the establishment to make its initial concession, but the pressure must be maintained to make the establishment deliver. The second factor seemed to be lost to the Woodlawn organization. Since the organization was blocked in the political arena, new tactics and a new arena had to be devised. O'Hare Airport became the target. To begin with, O'Hare is the world's busiest airport. Think for a moment of the common experience of jet travelers. Your stewardess brings you your lunch or dinner. After eating, most people want to go to the lavatory. However, this is often inconvenient because your tray, and those of your seat partners, are loaded down with dishes. So you wait until the stewardess has removed the trays. By that time those who are seated closest to the lavatory have got up, and the occupied sign is on. So you wait. And in these days of jet travel the seatbelt sign is soon flashed as the airplane starts its landing approach. You decide to wait until after landing, and use the facilities in the terminal. This is obvious to anyone who watches the unloading of passengers at various gates in any airport. Many of the passengers are making a beeline for the men's or the ladies' room. With this in mind, the tactic becomes obvious. We tie up the lavatories. In the restrooms you drop a dime, enter, push the lock on the door, and you can stay there all day. Therefore the occupation of the sit-down toilets presents no problem. It would take just a relatively few people to walk into these cubicles, armed with books and tactics 143 newspapers, lock the doors, and tie up all the facilities. What are the police going to do? Break in and demand evidence of legitimate occupancy. Therefore the ladies' restrooms could be occupied completely. The only problem in the men's lavatories would be the stand-up urinals. This, too, could be taken care of by having groups busy themselves around the airport and then move in on the stand-up urinals to line up 4 or 5 deep whenever a flight arrived. An intelligence study was launched to learn how many sit-down toilets, for both men and women, as well as stand-up urinals, there were in the entire O'Hare Airport complex, and how many men and women would be necessary for the nation's first sheet-in. The consequences of this kind of action would be catastrophic in many ways. People would be desperate for a place to relieve themselves. One can see children yelling at their parents, "Mommy, I've got to go," and desperate mothers surrendering, "All right, well, do it. Do it right here." O'Hare would soon become a shambles. The whole scene would become unbelievable, and the laughter and ridicule would be nationwide. It would probably get a front-page story in the London Times. It would be a source of great mortification and embarrassment to the city administration. It might even create the kind of emergency in which planes would have to be held up while passengers got back aboard to use the plane's toilet facilities. The threat of this tactic was leaked again. There may be a Freudian slip here, and again, so what? back to the administration, and within 48 hours the Woodlawn organization found itself in conference with the authorities, who said that they were certainly going to live up to their commitments, and they could never understand rules for Radicals 144, where anyone got the idea that a promise made by Chicago's City Hall would not be observed. At no point, then or since, has there ever been any open mention of the threat of the O'Hare tactic. Very few of the members of the Woodlawn organization knew how close they were to writing history. With the universal principle that the right things are always done for the wrong reasons, and the tactical rule that negatives become positives, we can understand the following examples. In its early history, the organized black ghetto in the Woodlawn neighborhood in Chicago engaged in conflict with the slum landlords. It never picketed the local slum tenements or the landlord's office. It selected its blackest blacks and bussed them out to the lily-white suburb of the slum landlord's residence. Their picket signs, which said, "Did you know that Jones, your neighbor, is a slum landlord?" were completely irrelevant. The point was that the pickets knew Jones would be inundated with phone calls from his neighbors. "Jones, before you say a word, let me tell you that those signs are a bunch of lies." "Neighbor, look Jones, I don't give a damn what you do for a living. All we know is that you get those goddamn niggers out of here or you get out." Jones came out and signed. The pressure that gave us our positive power was the negative of racism in a white society. We exploited it for our own purposes. Let us take one of the negative stereotypes that so many whites have of blacks, that blacks like to sit around eating watermelon. Suppose that 3,000 blacks suddenly tactics 145 descended into the downtown sections of any city, each armed with and munching a huge piece of watermelon. This spectacle would be so far outside the experience of the whites that they would be unnerved and disorganized. In alarm over what the blacks were up to, the establishment would probably react to the advantage of the blacks. Furthermore, the whites would recognize at last the absurdity of their stereotype of black habits. Whites would squirm in embarrassment knowing that they were being ridiculed. That would be the end of the black watermelon stereotype. I think that this tactic would bring the administration to contact black leadership and ask what their demands were, even if no demands had been made. Here again is a case of doing what you can with what you've got. Another example of doing what you can with what you've got is the following. I was lecturing at a college run by a very conservative, almost fundamentalist Protestant denomination. Afterward, some of the students came to my motel to talk to me. Their problem was that they couldn't have any fun on campus. They weren't permitted to dance or smoke or have a can of beer. I had been talking about the strategy of effecting change in a society, and they wanted to know what tactics they could use to change their situation. I reminded them that a tactic is doing what you can with what you've got. "Now, what have you got?" I asked. "What do they permit you to do?" "Practically nothing," they said, "except we can chew gum." I said fine. Gum becomes the weapon. You get 200 or 300 students to get 2 packs of gum, each, which is quite a wad. Then you have them drop it on the campus walks. This will cause absolute chaos. Why, with 500 wads of gum I could paralyze Chicago, stop all the traffic in the loop. They looked at me as though I was some kind of a nut. But about 2 weeks later I got an ecstatic letter saying it worked. It worked. Now we can do just about anything so long as we don't chew gum. Quoted in Marion K. Sanders' The Professional Radical Conversations with Saul Alinsky. As with the slum landlords, one of the major department stores in the nation was brought to heel by the following threat and tactic. Remember the rule: the threat is often more effective than the tactic itself, but only when you are so organized that the establishment knows not only that you have the power to execute the tactic, but that you definitely will. You can't do much bluffing in this game. If you're ever caught bluffing, forget about ever using threats in the future. On that point, you're dead. There is a particular department store that happens to cater to the carriage trade. It attracts many customers on the basis of its labels, as well as the quality of its merchandise. Because of this, economic boycotts had failed to deter even the black middle class from shopping there. At the time, its employment policies were more restrictive than those of the other stores. Blacks were hired for only the most menial jobs. We made up a tactic. A busy Saturday shopping date was selected. A Approximately 3,000 blacks all dressed up in their good church-going suits or dresses would be bussed downtown. When you put 3,000 blacks on the main floor of a store, even one that covers a square block, suddenly the entire color of the store changes. Any white coming through the revolving doors would take one pop-eyed look and assume that somehow he had stepped into Africa. He would keep right on going out of the store. This would end the white trade for the day. For a low-income group, shopping is a time-consuming experience, for economy means everything. This would mean that every counter would be occupied by potential customers, carefully examining the quality of merchandise, and asking, say, at the shirt counter, about the material, color style, cuffs colors, and price. As the group occupying the clerk's attention around the shirt counters moved to the underwear section, those at the underwear section would replace them at the shirt counter, and the personnel of the store would be constantly occupied. Now pause to examine the tactic. It is legal. There is no sit-in or unlawful occupation of premises. Some thousands of people are in the store shopping. The police are powerless, and you are operating within the law. This operation would go on until an hour before closing time, when the group would begin purchasing everything in sight to be delivered COD. This would tie up truck delivery service for at least 2 days, with obvious further heavy financial costs, since all the merchandise would be refused at the time of delivery. The threat was delivered to the authorities through a legitimate and trustworthy channel. Every organization must have 2 or 3 stool pigeons who are trusted by the establishment. These stool pigeons are invaluable as trustworthy lines of communication to the establishment. With all plans ready to go, we began formation of a series of committees: a transportation committee to get the buses, a mobilization committee to work with the ministers to get their people to their buses, and other committees with other specific functions. 2 of the key committees deliberately included one of these stoolies each, so that there would be one to back up the other. We knew the plan would be quickly reported back to the department store. The next day we received a call from the department store for a meeting to discuss new personnel policies, and an urgent request that the meeting take place within the next 2 or 3 days, certainly before Saturday. The personnel policies of the store were drastically changed. Overnight, 186 new jobs were opened. For the first time, blacks were on the sales floor and in executive training. This is the kind of tactic that can be used by the middle class too. Organized shopping, wholesale buying plus charging and returning everything on delivery would add accounting costs to their attack on the retailer, with the ominous threat of continued repetition. This is far more effective than canceling a charge account. Let's look at the score. 1. Sales for 1 day are completely shot. 2. Delivery service is tied up for 2 days or more. And 3. The accounting department is screwed up. The total cost is a nightmare for any retailer, and the sword remains hanging over his head. The middle class, too, must learn the nature of the enemy, and be able to practice what I have described as mass jujitsu, utilizing the power of one part of the power structure against another part. Competition. Once we understand the external reactions of the haves to the challenges of the have-nots, then we go to tactics 149, the next level of examination, the anatomy of power of the haves among themselves. But let us go deeper into the psyche of this Goliath. The haves possess and in turn are possessed by power. Obsessed with the fear of losing power, their every move is dictated by the idea of keeping it. The way of life of the haves is to keep what they have, and wherever possible, to shore up their defenses. This opens a new vista. Not only do we have a whole class determined to keep its power and in constant conflict with the have-nots, at the same time, they are in conflict among themselves. Power is not static. It cannot be frozen and preserved like food. It must grow or die. Therefore, in order to keep power, the status quo must get more. But from whom? There is just so much more than can be squeezed out of the have-nots, so the haves must take it from each other. They are on a road from which there is no turning back. This power cannibalism of the haves permits only temporary truces, and only when equally confronted by a common enemy. Even then there are regular breaks in the ranks, as individual units attempt to exploit the general threat for their own special benefit. Here is the vulnerable belly of the status quo. I first learned this lesson during the 1930s Depression, when the United States experienced a revolutionary upheaval in the form of a mass labor union organizing drive known as the CIO. This was the radical wing of the labor movement. It espoused industrial unionism, while the conservative and archaic AF of L clung to craft unionism. The position of the AF of L excluded the masses of workers from union organization. The battle cry of the CIO was organize the unorganized. Very quickly the issue was joined with the gargantuan automobile industry, Rules for Radicals 150, which was at that time an open shop and completely unorganized. The first attack was against the behemoth of this empire, General Motors. A sit-down strike was launched against Chevrolet. John L. Lewis, then the leader of the CIO, told me that at the height of this sit-down strike he heard a rumor that General Motors had met with both Ford and Chrysler to advance the following proposition. We at General Motors are fighting your battle, for if the CIO beats us, then you're next in line and there will be no stopping them. Now we are willing to let the CIO sit in at Chevrolet until hell freezes, and suffer that loss in our profits, / you will hold your production of Fords and Plymouths left bracket the price class competitors, to the Chevrolet right bracket, to your present market. On the other hand, we cannot hold out against the CIO, if you boost production in order to sell to all potential Chevrolet customers, who will buy your products because they cannot get Chevrolets. Lewis, who was an organizational genius, with a rare insight into the power mechanics of the status quo, dismissed it with a perceptive comment. It doesn't matter whether this is a false rumor or true, he said, because neither Ford nor Chrysler could ever agree to overlook an opportunity for an immediate increase in their profits and power, short-sighted as it might be. The internecine struggle among the haves for their individual self-interest is as short-sighted as internecine struggle among the have-nots. I have on occasion remarked that I feel confident that I could persuade a millionaire on a Friday to subsidize a revolution for Saturday, out of which he would make a huge profit on Sunday, even though he was certain to be executed on Monday. Once one understands this internal battle for power within the status quo, one can begin to appraise effective tactics to exploit it. It is sad to see the stupidity of inexperienced organizers, who make gross errors by failing to have even an elementary appreciation of this pattern. An example is to be found just a couple of years ago, when during the height of the rising tide of the struggle for civil rights, certain civil rights leaders in Chicago declared a Christmas boycott on the department stores downtown. The boycott was a disastrous failure, and any experienced revolutionary could have predicted without any reservations that this would have been the case. Any attack against the status quo must use the strength of the enemy against itself. Let us examine this particular boycott. The error was in trying to boycott all, instead of some. Few liberals, white or black, would forego all Christmas shopping in the most attractive shopping places. Even if it had not been the Christmas season, we know that picket lines are relatively ineffective today in stopping the general population. There is a low degree of identification on the part of the general population with the labor movement or with picket lines in general. However, even that low degree can be exploited by placing a picket line in front of only one department store. If the same merchandise can be purchased at the same price at another department store across the street, the slight uneasiness that the picket line creates can affect a significant number of customers. They have an easy enough, visible enough alternative. They will cross the street. The power squeeze comes when the picketed department store sees a number of customers going across to its competitors. This calculated maneuvering of the power of one part of the haves against its other parts is central to strategy. In a certain sense, it is similar to the have-not nations playing off the USA against the USSR. Their own petard. The basic tactic in warfare against the haves is a mass political jujitsu. The have-nots do not rigidly oppose the haves, but yield in such planned and skilled ways that the superior strength of the haves becomes their own undoing. For example, since the haves publicly pose as the custodians of responsibility, morality, law, and justice, which are frequently strangers to each other, they can be constantly pushed to live up to their own book of morality and regulations. No organization, including organized religion, can live up to the letter of its own book. You can club them to death with their book of rules and regulations. This is what that great revolutionary, Paul of Tarsus, knew when he wrote to the Corinthians, who also hath made us able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter killeth. Let us take, for example, the case of the civil rights demonstrations of 1963 in Birmingham, when thousands of Negro children stayed out of school to participate in the street demonstrations. The Birmingham Board of Education dusted off its book of regulations and threatened to expel all children absent for this reason. Here the civil rights leaders erred as they did on other vital tactics by backing off instead of rushing in with more demonstrations and pressing the Birmingham Board of Education between the pages of their book of regulations by forcing them to live up to the letter of their regulations and statements. The board and the city of Birmingham would have been in an impossible situation, with every Negro child tactics 153 expelled and loose on the streets. If they didn't reverse themselves before they acted, they would have reversed themselves one day later. Another dramatic failure to understand tactics came during the second Chicago public school boycott in 1964, a struggle against a de facto segregated public school system. We know that the efficacy of any action is in the reaction it evokes from the haves, so that the cycle escalates in a continuum of conflict. Lacking any reaction from the haves except public notice of the numbers of children involved, effects of the boycott were significantly over by the next day. This boycott was what I call a terminal tactic, one that crests, breaks, and disappears like a wave. Terminal tactics do not arouse the reaction that is essential for the development of a conflict. A terminal tactic is to be exercised only to finish a conflict, for it is ineffective in the development of the rhythm of give and take that one must have while stepping up the war and building the movement. Civil rights leaders could console themselves with the psychological carryovers, public display of support, and similar prayerful hopes, but as for carrying on the conflict, for integration, that was over and done with by the next day. Nice memory. In Chicago, the haves slipped badly when both a judge and a district attorney muttered that the Book of Regulations banned attempts to induce the absence of public school students, and growled ominously about an injunction against all civil rights leaders taking part in the development of the boycott. Here, as always, whenever the haves start living by their book, they present a golden opportunity to the have-nots to transform what had been a terminal tactic into a sweeping advance on rules for radicals 154 many fronts. The children wouldn't need to be absent, the leaders would be the only people who needed to act. Now was the time to start an intensive campaign of ridicule, insults, and taunting defiance, daring the district attorney and the judge either to live up to their regulations and issue the injunctions, or stand publicly exposed as fearful frauds who were afraid to put the law where their mouths were. Such behavior on the part of the have-nots would probably have resulted in the injunction. But by this time the boycott tactic would have had shaking consequences. Immediately following the boycott, every civil rights leader in the city of Chicago involved in it would have been in violation of the court injunction. But the last thing that the establishment wants is to indict and imprison every single civil rights leader, which would have included leaders of every religious organization in town in the city of Chicago. Such a step would have shaken the power structure of Chicago, and certainly put the entire issue of school segregation policy on the line. Without any question, the district attorney and the judge would have had to depend on postponements, in the hope that everybody would just forget about it. At this point, now that the civil rights leaders had the powerful weapon of the Book of Laws of the Haves, they would have to stand fast publicly, once again taunting, insulting, demanding that the judge and the district attorney obey the law, charging that the district attorney and the courts had issued an injunction, which they had publicly, willfully, and maliciously violated, and that they therefore must be compelled to pay the penalties for this action. If the civil rights leaders insisted that they be arrested and tried, the haves would be on the run, and in complete confusion, caught in the straitjacket of their own book. Tactics 155. Enforcement of their injunction would have resulted in a citywide storm of protest and a rapid growth in the organization. Non-enforcement would have signaled a breakdown and retreat of the haves from the have-nots and also resulted in swelling the size and force of the have-not organization. Time in jail. The reaction of the status quo in jailing revolutionary leaders is in itself a tremendous contribution to the development of the have-not movement as well as to the personal development of the revolutionary leaders. This point should be carefully remembered as another example of how mass jujitsu tactics can be used to so maneuver the status quo that it turns its power against itself.